fellow Toastmasters, guests, I have a story to tell you tonight, and it's something that changed not only my life, but someone else's life, because it's about something that happened at sea. I started taking sailing lessons a few years ago. I actually became a person that became part of a sailing crew. So we would actually race every Thursday afternoon from the Davis Island Yacht Club. So my friend, who happened to be an attorney, his name was Lou, myself and one of Lou's friends, who happened to be named Charles, had to go to St. Petersburg on a Friday night and pick up a sailboat. So that means we got to sail across Tampa Bay in the dead of night. And in itself, that wouldn't be such a great task. But if I told you the winds were whipping and the seas were rough and churning and all that good stuff, that would make for a good story. But it wasn't that case. Matter of fact, had the seas been rough and the winds would have been churning, the story would have definitely a different ending. But because the story manifested itself in such a way that on our way back from St. Pete, we was in the channel. Anybody that's ever sailed or did any boating, you know the channel is, they got channel markers, which is like a highway in the middle of the ocean. And typically, there's danger on each side of the channel marker. So you're supposed to stay inside the channel, inside the markers. And we're in basically a 32-foot sailboat. And for anybody that's familiar with sailboats, there's no motor on a sailboat. That's why it's called sailing. And it's three of us, and I am probably the least experienced sailor of the group. And it just happened, give or take, about 11 o'clock at night, Friday night. We're sailing, and the other two guys beneath, they're in there having some kind of conversation. I got left out. I got the responsibility of sailing everybody back, and they're in there farting around and having fun and doing something other than sailing. And I hear off into the distance, I could not make out the sound, but the fact that I'm on a sailboat and we're in the middle of the middle of the bay, a bird, what at first sounded like a bird, chirping off into the distance. God be what it is, I can actually hear this bird sound over everything. There's no other boats. I think we only saw two boats the whole night. One was a shrimp boat coming in, and it had lots of lights and lots of birds flying around it. And the other one was a big, I guess, a barge coming in. So those are only two boats we saw all night. But I still heard this bird chirping off into the distance, and it bothered me that I heard this bird chirping off in the distance, because the more I concentrated on this sound in the middle of nowhere, you could not see 10 feet from the boat. And we're in the middle of the channel, so there's no lights. There's no street lights in the middle of the channel. And our boat only had two lights, one at the front, one at the back, the bow and the stern. And I got concerned, so I called the other two guys up. I said, just listen. And they listened. And I said, do you hear that sound? And it took them a while to hear it, because it was off in the distance. And what happened was we actually passed the sound, because while I was trying to figure out the sound, we passed it. And in a sailboat, you can't back up. There's no reverse on a sailboat. So once we got past the sound, and they said, yeah, we hear it. And they said the same thing I said. It sounds like a bird. But I said, that's no bird. And so we tacked, because you can't, there's no reverse, and then we're going downwind, so the wind was blowing us to Tampa. So we had to literally tack, which is going back and forth to go back into the wind. And we got to a point to where we can actually hear it. And there was a man in the water hanging on to an igloo cooler.
Oh my gosh.
His boat had capsized 5 o'clock that afternoon. So he had been in that water for 6 or 7 hours, with hanging onto an igloo with a gallon jug of water tied to his waist. When we finally got to him, because we passed it, because again we had no lights on the boat, so we saw him in the water and we threw a life preserver to him, because again we had to tack back, because once we passed, we had to tack back to him. He was so weak he could not climb into the boat. So one of us had to dive over in the water and help this guy out of the water. His name was Brian. And it was God's will, because no one else would have found him that evening, because there was nobody else out there but us. And the fact that we was in a sailboat and there was no motor on that boat is the only reason I could hear him. And like I say, it sounded like a bird chirping until I determined that it wasn't a bird. I didn't know what it was, but it was something told me to go follow that sound. And we pulled that guy out of the water. His boat capsized. He had lost his dog. No one was expecting him back until Monday. So no one would have even been looking for him. We found him. It was God's will that we found him. And I was told in presenting the story that we're supposed to come up with a moral of the story. The moral of the story is faith is one of the most powerful elements that exists, because it was God's will and faith that we found him, or else this guy would have been dead. Fellow Toastmasters, that is a true story.